So it was almost 2 years ago now that I recorded a video on ways to keep combat interesting in D&D and tabletop games. And yeah, look at this guy. Young, fresh-faced, barely a concern in the world. Certainly never wore one of these things, did he? In that video, I talked about some of my favorite ways to describe combat in interesting ways, immersive ways, to keep players engaged and to keep myself engaged. This includes things like using the exact number of an attack roll to determine precisely why an attack has hit or missed, and use that as part of my description of the attack. If you'd like more details on that, then I will leave a link to the video and my younger, prettier self in the description for you to check out. What I'd like to do today is use this video to talk about a few more ideas for encounters in tabletop games and ways that you can make them interesting. As usual, the majority of what I have to say will apply to most tabletop games, although as a D&D guy, that is where my focus is going to be. One thing I've been doing recently is this idea of combat flow during an encounter. If you imagine in D&D, a round of combat usually takes 6 seconds, which means that if you have 10 or more creatures moving, taking actions within a round, that's quite hectic. If you actually imagine how that would look within 6 seconds, 10 attacks, 10 spells, 10 people moving 30 feet each, this is not the same as it would look on a tabletop or a digital tabletop, where you have one thing moving at a time, making an attack, another thing moving, making an attack. It's very hectic, very frantic, and I try and get that across in my descriptions. And one of the ways that I do that is by flowing one move, one turn directly into the next one. So rather than saying, okay, you swing your greatsword at the goblin, you hit, you deal 6 damage, the goblin pulls a scimitar and goes for you. He does hit you, but you only take 2 damage. Okay, you're gonna fire your bow at the goblin. Rather than doing that, which is fine, but rather than doing that, what I would do is try and flow them in. So you swing your greatsword down towards the goblin's face. It tries to lift its own scimitar to block, isn't quite able to do it. You break through the block, dealing 6 damage, leaving a huge gash across its face. As it's reeling from that attack, it staggers backwards, lunges forwards, just catching you on the leg. 2 damage to you. Archer over there, you see this taking place. You draw your bow, waiting for the goblin to step into your sights. As it does so, you loose the arrow, thunk, straight through the chest, knocking it to the ground. And the difference is subtle, but essentially what I'm doing is using the end of the previous action to inform the beginning of the next action. And that just adds a little bit more dynamism and makes the combat just feel a little bit more immersive. Used correctly, this sort of description can make combat feel quite cinematic and reactive. I definitely wouldn't do this for every single action, as I think using the same flavor too much can lead to a bit of fatigue, plus it's an extra bit of work on me to exactly remember the situation in which things were left for the next turn and the next turn and the next. And again, of course, sometimes combat is just that busy and that hectic that the only thing you can really do is just go hit, next, hit, next, hit, next. I also like the idea of using initiative or the initiative system outside of combat. In my games, roll for initiative doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a fight, it just means that there is going to be an engagement or an encounter in which quick reactions, reflexes are going to be needed. So example to use here would be the classic, the rolling boulder trap, Indiana Jones style. You could run this as a skill check, you could just run this as the trap is set off, everyone starts running, they make a few skill rolls to leap over an obstacle or get past something or other, and then they reach safety. Or you could set off the trap, roll initiative. They then have to decide, okay, well, the boulder's going to move, let's say 5 feet every time a player takes a turn. So in a total round, it might move 25, 30 feet, depending how many you have. The players then need to decide, with their movement, the limited actions they have, are they going to try and use spells? Are they going to try and dash? Are they going to try and leap to safety, climb something? And just calling it an initiative roll and using that system means that the pressure is on and they have to start thinking how they're going to react in a more immediate sense. This could be equally applied to a collapsing rope bridge, or a falling building. Anything in which quick reactions are necessary from each person in order to survive a situation. The alternative being they could just say, oh, I dodge out of the way. But no, I would like to see you try to dodge out of the way. I would like you to use your movement to reach a specific point, use an action, and survive using all of the skills that your character has. I'd also like to talk about encounter design a little bit, and I think this is something that I have improved at over time. First of all, for me, I think it's important that not every encounter is a fight to the death. There shouldn't be a constant threat of deadly encounters, if you want to use that terminology from the DMG, of, oh, we're literally always about to die, because that's exhausting. If you think about it from a video game design perspective, you would never have a boss battle in every single room, unless I guess you were playing Titan Souls. But what I mean by this is let them stomp a few enemies occasionally. Give them some that are deliberately way underpowered. It can still be interesting, you can still add tactical interest, maybe it's happening in an interesting environment, maybe there's time pressure, but let them bash a few heads in. That's always fun, and it lets them just sort of show off and use their abilities, and maybe lose a few hit points, maybe use a few resources, but just have a bit of fun. In terms of encounter design as well, the concept of countering player abilities is something that I've struggled with. My main game that I'm DMing at the moment, we do have a monk, and yes, he does Stunning Strike, literally everything, and yes, it is annoying. But as much as it's tempting to engineer a situation in which suddenly they're up against loads of enemies that all have immunity to stun or resistance to stun, that's not quite fair, because the game is designed in such a way that the monk can stun enemies. It costs them a resource to do this, it costs them a key point every time they want to use a Stunning Strike. That's the trade-off, that's the balance. When this equally applies to, let's say you have a party member that's always using invisibility or any other form of ability, if you then plan encounters specifically to negate that ability, that player is going to feel quite rightly picked on, and it's not going to be fun for them. Rather than planning to negate a specific ability, it is within your power, as it is your responsibility to ensure that things are still fun, and just stunning and stomping on every enemy one at a time is not fun. It is your responsibility to make things interesting. So, using the Stunning Strike monk as an example, give them more than one target they would want to use the Stunning Strike on. Make it so that it isn't just one boss enemy that they're fighting, that they can, over time, just statistically eventually stun, and then everyone can pile on them. Make there be 2 or 3 enemies of equal threat. That means they have to choose. And consider your enemy's intelligence here, particularly if you have a big bad who is an intelligent character, and your players have had encounters with their minions in the past. Reports of those battles will get back to the big bad, and they will know, oh, this group literally always uses invisibility when they start a fight. They always go invisible, and then they sneak in and they start slitting throats and causing chaos. Then they might start supplying items that provide true sight, or even just hanging big bags of flour on ropes that their minions can cut and drop flour all over your invisible players. And hey, suddenly you can see where they are because they're covered in flour. And things like that, rather than just negating a player ability or a party ability, if you make it so that something they have done has been noticed and the enemies have changed their tactics in response to that, that will make your world feel alive, that will make your world feel responsive, and the players will feel as though they have had an impact, not only on the world, but on the specific enemy that they're fighting, because they've had to change the way they fight in order to deal with this group. And on that, I think it's important to consider the intelligence level of the enemies that your players are fighting. Are they intelligent enough to go for the high damage, low health wizard who's standing at the back, cowering behind everybody else? Or are they just going to sort of run in and get stuck into a melee? Particularly if it's a high intelligence enemy who has minions, they might order some of their others to attack the low health, high damage wizard. If your big bad is standing behind a line of archers, he's just going to say to all of them, shoot that wizard. And then suddenly you have a tactical problem. Their level of intelligence will also determine whether they will try and go for the biggest threat to a group or the biggest threat to them personally. Whether they will think about killing blows, a group of intelligent enemies may or may not go for a killing blow. And by a killing blow, I mean if a player is down to 0 hit points, are they going to finish him off or move on to the next one? I would suggest that for the vast majority, they will go for the ones that are still standing on the basis that they are still a threat. If they feel like they have won the fight, or that they can win the fight by scaring off their enemies, by slaughtering one of theirs on the ground, they might go for the killing blow. That killing blow, that like coup de grace, is something that I've struggled with as a DM, because if you have the opportunity for it, do you take it? Is it fair in that moment? Does it feel good as a player to receive, or to be on the receiving end of that? That's still something I'm struggling with, so I'd love to hear comments about that, and indeed about anything else I've said, any other ways that you like to make combat interesting or encounters interesting, any interesting encounters that you've run. I love hearing D&D stories, so please, please, please fill my comments with them, and I promise you I will read every single one, and I will try to respond to as many as I possibly can. If you have found this video helpful or interesting in any way, please let me know in the comments, drop a like. If you want to see more videos coming up from me, hit the subscribe button. I'd love for you to come back. Regardless, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me chatting about D&D, and I'll see you next time.